Good afternoon and welcome to running a £100,000 crowdfunding campaign. My name is Howard Lake. I am the publisher of UK Fundraising, which is an online resource for charity fundraisers that I've published for the last 23 years to help fundraisers make the most of digital fundraising. And I'm very pleased to say that I'm speaking today with Jonathan May, who is the founder of crowdfunding platform Hubbub, and he's also an associate partner of more. Welcome, Jonathan. Today we're talking about your latest report that you've written, A Guide to Major Crowdfunding. Tell us why you wrote the report.
Right, good question. Well, I've been in this space for 6 years with Hubbub, and a couple of years before that as well, actually, looking at crowdfunding as an area for fundraisers to get into. And one of the observations I had was that there were a lot of common patterns emerging in success and failure of campaigns, but that crowdfunding was being seen as this kind of a bit of a black box, a bit of an experiment, a thing we might pilot and try, but not necessarily something that was well understood by people in the sector. And as a result, there were lots of people almost ready to jump in and do it, but not quite ready to, not quite sure what those first steps should be. Most organizations, when they look to start doing some new form of fundraising, are also looking for some test around return on investment. Is it worth engaging with it if it's just small scale stuff? So what I set out to do was bring together the common patterns of success in a guide that allows people to take advantage of crowdfunding and also raise a fairly significant sum of money in the process. It's also key to note that running a major crowdfunding campaign is a bit different to running a smaller one. So a few hundred to a few £1,000s, those kind of campaigns can be run by just reaching out to very immediate networks, because the capacity in those networks is able to do that. Whereas when you look at the 100K plus level, the patterns of engagement need to change. The kind of people that need to be involved in funding those campaigns and fundraising for those campaigns need to change. And so, yeah, this is an attempt to bring together the 6 years plus of learning in the space and effectively give it back so that we can get more people with the confidence and the skills and the knowledge about how to take advantage of crowdfunding within their organizations.
Great, thank you. Okay, the timetable for the next 45-50 minutes is to break out the report that you can download, and there is a link to the download PDF in the handouts section. And we'll break it into 4 different topics, each lasting about 10 minutes. We'll ask Jonathan to go into some detail on those. And at the same time, whenever you get a question, please do ask it. You'll see there's a chat box probably to the right of your screen, and just ask a question, and what we'll try and do is pull those all together, common themes, at the end of the session, so that'll take us up to the full 55 minutes to 60 minutes. So do ask the questions, and I'll keep reminding you to ask specific questions. So we're going to break it down into 4 different topics, and the first one, I think, is about getting started. We're not just going to read out the report, that wouldn't make good use of your time, but we are going to base it on the findings of Jonathan's report. So the first section is planning your campaign. We'll then go on to looking at utilizing your networks, followed by the key issue of donor data, and then we'll finish with tools and communities. How do you use those? How do you find the community? And obviously then we'll conclude with questions and answers. So Jonathan, planning your campaign, looking at crowdfunding, what is the first step that people should take when they're about, or when they think they need to run a major crowdfunding campaign?
Okay, well, one of the key exercises that has to happen in advance of running a campaign is an assessment of what we actually need and can raise. The target setting determines an awful lot about the communications and the messaging and the networks and the scale, of course, as well. And this is one of those classic problems people come to in the space, which is a sort of underlying instinct that there's an amount they can raise, a need which is often substantially greater than the amount that they are confident in raising, and that gap presents a real problem. because where there is a difference between what we think we need and then what we're actually trying to raise, or what we think we can raise, there's a real nervousness, particularly around things like all or nothing funding. If I set a target which is more ambitious than I'm confident in, then I can be very nervous naturally about not reaching that target in the first place, or not reaching that target eventually, and then as a result potentially losing out on that income. So one of the first exercises that has to happen is that goal setting exercise. It's looking at this from two different levels. One of them is the top-down analysis. So what are we actually trying to achieve? What are those costs? How do they break out? What will help us actually get there? And actually effectively running the budget of whatever project it is you're trying to get to from a top-down level. The second is from a bottom-up level, doing an assessment of what networks do we currently have, what kind of audiences do we think would be interested in this campaign, and how could we go about reaching them? What's their kind of capacity? How many can we engage with them? How many of them can we engage with? Those two analyses will give you very different numbers, almost certainly. So it's very likely that the bottom-up analysis will give you a number that is a bit lower than the top-down one. Aspirations greater than current capacity. And what we're trying to do in this goal-setting process is pull those as close together as we can. So if there's a huge disparity between those two numbers, we know where we need to put the effort in. And if you look on the guide, pages 9 and 10 have some examples of how you go about building both the top-down and the bottom-up analysis of campaigns. It's worth saying that there are also a number of other tools, one of which Hubbub has built and you can take a look at, which is the crowdfunding campaign simulator. That's at crowdfundcalculator.com, I think, currently. And what that does is it takes your bottom-up analysis and runs a simulation of the campaign based upon that to see what a kind of middle ground is. What can you really raise from that kind of initial network? And again, as I said, what we're trying to do here is get confident in where we should set that crowdfunding, that initial target. Okay, when you're looking to run a bigger campaign, the single most important thing is that you deliver momentum all the way through. And so what we don't want to be doing is setting that target so low that we cross it quickly and therefore lose momentum, or so high that it looks like it's such a long way to get there that people aren't actually that engaged in helping initially. So yeah, the goal setting really comes into the first set of exercises. It's probably the most important thing you do from stage one. Okay. And actually it's worth saying that that is a little backward, because most people approach crowdfunding from the point of view of, I've got a project, which platform shall I run it on? Yes. And this is a key observation from the sector. We may come on to this in a little bit more detail. Platforms don't drive donors. There are some really important features of platforms that can help particular organizations or sectors to get the best out of crowdfunding, but platforms don't drive donors. So the first sets of activities are goal setting, the team and the resourcing, the messaging communications, the influencer comms. So you've got all this in the document, and the platform choice should be driven by features that are relevant for the organization, not by desire to be on necessarily the best known or the biggest or the one that you feel you've heard of or a friend has used. It's much more about how you do the exercise of crowdfunding than what the platform itself can deliver.
So not surprisingly, it is the fundraising discipline of strategy that comes first.
Yeah, and as I've said in this guide, I think on the first page, this isn't rocket science. It can all be learned. It can all be executed. It's just a question of having read about what you need to do, got the planning and the team in place, and actually then really execute well on that campaign.
So in terms of the planning, what is the timescale for a major crowdfunding campaign? How much in advance would you start planning it?
I think in the ideal case, you're talking in the 3 to 6 months. Most organizations, of course, coming to crowdfunding for the first time have a slightly more immediate need than that. We see a lot of people coming with an urgent requirement to fund a project that maybe has lost its funding, or they need to find a slightly more diverse income source for it. Now, if you're looking to run a 100K plus campaign, you're going to need to go through the exercises of influencer analysis, network mapping, communications planning, as well as potentially looking into match funding and challenge funding as other sources of income. And to talk to all of those people, to engage all of those people, to run the relevant workshops. If you're not looking at a 3 to 6 month timeline before you launch, you're going to find yourself cutting an awful lot of corners. With that said, there are a couple of examples of people running fairly large campaigns by taking effectively this guide and squashing it into the 1 to 2 weeks that they actually had to get live. It can be done, but it's then a full-time commitment for somebody. And if you're going to cut corners, you know, you can. The corners to cut are perhaps the ones that are least expected. So, you know, crowdfunding's a funny thing. Everybody thinks the video is super important and the quality of it's super important. Of course, when people give online, they're really giving to other people. And so what really matters is that video is honest, has integrity, and has a human being at the other end of it. What doesn't matter is that that video is polished, finished, with a beautiful backing soundtrack, etc. So what's really important is that you figure out which corners to cut. You can't cut the network ones, you can't cut the planning ones, you can cut the little finesse on the end of the video.
Okay, so that's useful, especially for organizations that are pressed for time. In terms of resourcing this, how many team members would you recommend putting together or recruiting to run a major crowdfunding campaign? Okay,
so this is actually about diversity of team members as much as it is about resource. Crowdfunding at an organization, say a small, mid-sized, or even a very large nonprofit, is about having engagement with the relevant people in the organization that are going to need to be able to talk about it, be aware of it. If you think about the disciplines in crowdfunding, they're not just fundraising, they're also messaging and communications. They're also the entire digital channel, so whoever runs the social media teams is going to need to be involved. It's likely that you're going to look at major giving as well through match funding, challenge funding, and effectively those who could seed or inspire bigger gifts on the platform. And when you're looking at those areas, you can easily see that it's somebody from your major giving team, potentially somebody from a corporate relations team, somebody from the digital team and the social media team, ideally some trustees, because they have a really valuable role to play in some of the more influential people that you could get involved. And what's needed is it's not for all of those people to be seconded full-time into the team. It's for them to commit to certain sets of actions and critically regular check-ins to make sure that we are all on the same page with this campaign. The last thing you want to happen is somebody to hear about an amazing campaign an organization is running, land on the website and see no mention of it. But this is a very common pattern in the space where actually until and unless we've got the digital team involved in the campaign, they won't necessarily even be aware of it. And the idea of updating the front page of a website to reflect it is a challenging one without them having heard about it in advance. What I would say though is that one person will need to work on that crowdfunding campaign essentially full-time for the planning and delivery and post-delivery of that campaign, which is often going to be at least a 6-month period in total and sometimes longer.
Yeah. So that's a minimum for a crowdfunding any crowdfunding campaign. You need a minimum of one person full-time.
Yeah, at this scale, yes. My personal feeling is that you know, once you start crossing the 100K threshold from a targeting point of view, it isn't feasible to run this as a background project or as a seconded project. This is a full-time piece of fundraising work.
So it's unlikely that it's going to be someone who has an existing job that you're just going to second to run this, because that will lose income from their original role. Or can they manage both?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it's a question of whether or not their job runs in peaks and troughs. There's some organizations where they're only running 1 or 2 annual appeals a year. There will be some periods where there is a lot less time dedicated directly towards fundraising. I would say then the question is, if we take that person off their ongoing activities, say, you know, which may be focused around donor stewardship or future campaign planning, etc., are we actually creating a problem in the long term? Certainly some of the organizations we're working with on the larger campaigns now have hired in at least 3 days a week of additional full-time support to run major campaigns. I think one of the problems here is that It's not like there's a crowd of amazing people out there that you can go and hire to do this crowdfunding work. And in order to run a campaign, you have to innately understand the cause of the organization and really be able to speak to it. So I do think it's valuable to look at seconding people internally, but there is a big question about whether or not you're going to cause a problem in that other area of work. So I think that's about fitting crowdfunding around the cycles of other campaigns that you do as an organization to make sure it's part of the bigger picture, rather than being just an isolated activity on the side.
You mentioned trustees and their role in a successful major crowdfunding campaign. Have you got any tips on inspiring them or ensuring that they speak to the brief of the campaign?
I think there's two different elements to this. So there's one, helping trustees understand the benefits of crowdfunding above and beyond just the money that comes in. And when you talk about the ability for crowdfunding to join up different parts of an organization, the marketing, the communications, the longer term fundraising plan, and also the fact that most crowdfunding campaigns onboard a large number of donors that organizations have no prior relationship with. You know, once a trustee can understand that this is not just a one-off piece of fundraising, but a significant long-term capacity building exercise and a significant long-term acquisition of new donors and new relationships, that's a really key, valuable point to be making to trustees. The second thing is in terms of how you actually get them engaged and involved, and this largely depends on two things. The trustees of many organizations are either in a position to contribute themselves or they aren't. But in either case, they are substantial. They have generally substantial influence in networks. Those who have the capacity to contribute should be asked to, and they should be asked to from the point of view of being match funders for the campaign, matching gifts in the US, challenge donors, so people who will give if we raise a certain amount of money. Or if we get a certain number of donors, and those who can't should be involved in the network mapping exercises. So we have a whole section on this in the report, but thinking about how you get to the kind of organizations, networks, and audiences that you want to reach for the campaign, because your trustees can pick the phone up or drop an email to almost anybody in the world and get responses, whereas that's often really quite hard for fundraising teams to do on their own.
Which brings us on to the second stage of utilizing networks. So thank you very much for those of you that are typing in some chats and questions. By all means, do share your questions or comments or other ideas as well for Jonathan to answer. You can use the chat box down the right-hand side, if that's the way you've set it up on your screen. Just ask any questions and we'll make sure that Jonathan answers them before we finish today. So the second question, second section is utilizing networks. Can you recommend how to identify key donor networks? How do you then go on to determine their propensity to give? How much should you ask them for? Right.
So I mean, this is a key part of trying to work out how you build this wider audience for a campaign. So if you go back to the network, effectively the bottom-up analysis we did, that can provide a basis for the kind of capacity that exists within the network we know about today. And the bit that's often missing when we then try and take that into a kind of messaging or an audience-based piece of promotion, direct or indirect, is the piece of research that goes around assessing their individual responses to the messaging and their capacity and interest in getting involved. And if you're running any kind of a capital campaign, you would almost certainly undertake some kind of feasibility study, which would involve a number of interviews with potential key contributors to that campaign. The same piece of work needs to be done in a crowdfunding context. If you're thinking about reaching out to a 10,000 strong audience in the public space who happen to be part of a particular segment because of their demographics or their interest in the topic, it would be crazy not to test your campaign messaging on a small subset of that audience in advance. But this rarely happens, and this is one of the areas where that 3 to 6 month run-in is so important. The two benefits to getting a subset of that audience in: one, you actually get to know if your message is resonating with them, and you get an idea of the kind of contribution those people can and will make to the campaign. The second is that by asking them to be involved in your planning, you've actually identified and onboarded a number of people who could make fantastic advocates or ambassadors for your campaign when it goes live. And so once you've identified those larger public segments who could be interested in this, bringing them into the planning through workshops where you test your messaging with them, and into effectively a Q&A, an iterative process of how does this sound? Is this the kind of thing that that you'd be interested in engaging with? Do you know anybody else that might like this? You know, that's the discovery part when it comes to working out what are the messages that both get, you know, both basically engage people and get them to care enough about them that they can become an advocate on your behalf. This is something that's this is something that most fundraisers know a lot about, actually. And so the idea that stories are important is really well understood. But in the crowdfunding space, it's not just that they are that they're great stories. It's that they're great stories that need to be A, retellable, and B, extremely short. So you're dealing with social media channels. So really, if we can't express why this is important in 140 characters or fewer, perhaps now 280 or whatever it is, but it needs to be extremely succinct. And obviously the retellable nature of stories is critical as well. So all very well thinking that I as a donor might give to a campaign, but what we really need in crowdfunding is not that I just give to it, but I understand it well enough to explain to you why you should give to it. And that's often really the key difference here between a more direct approach to marketing and the indirect one that crowdfunding lends itself so well to.
So that's quite a skill to be able to pass on, or at least make trustees and other ambassadors aware of conciseness.
Yeah, absolutely.
The ability to convey something, as you say, within a tweet.
Yeah,
very short.
And I think if you're from an aspirational point of view, I always say we need to aim at a hashtag. Because if you aim at a hashtag, you will get down to 10 or 15 words. Getting actually all the way to the hashtag, brilliant if you can. But you know, if you aim at the hashtag, there's a good chance you'll get to something that's concise enough and simple enough and clear enough that people can actually take it on and retell it.
So how do you motivate these ambassadors for the campaign?
Oh, that's a fab question. So we've tried a number of things. So we've been running this kind of ambassador advocate program for a while, and there are essentially there's essentially two ways that have appeared to work. I'd say that you're either looking at a what's the best way of explaining this? So ambassadors for a campaign will advocate for it because they care about the campaign itself, not because of the whatever incentive mechanism you build around it. So it's very common to see organizations rewarding the best ambassadors with particular benefits, you know, free t-shirts, tickets to things, all the kind of classic rewards you might see on a crowdfunding campaign. But the reality of the situation is that that's not what's underlying the motivation of the ambassador to get involved. The real sort of underlying drive there is that they care about the campaign and it matters to them, and which is why it's so critical to get them involved early on. And once you've launched a campaign, you know, you're running into a problem of these people are not on your side, whereas what crowdfunding is all about is building the team of people who are inside before you start. So this motivation, this is an interesting one. The mechanisms that drive the real engagement above and beyond just the caring are all about their ability to see the impact of the actions that they're taking. So it's really important that if the platform technology you're using supports this, that you use this feature well. So social sharing links, the ability to track the impact of somebody's sharing on the giving and the engagement behavior of others. This is really empowering for people to see, I have caused £1,000 to be given to this campaign. If it doesn't support that, which is quite common, and most of the platforms don't have this kind of functionality, what you need to do is reinforce the impact all the time of the work done by your advocates. So even if it's just in the last week, we've raised an extra 4,000, 5,000, 10,000, continually tell them why they're making a big difference. That's the thing that actually drives engagement. Not the t-shirts.
No, fair enough. So keep the t-shirts for the donors, the people who want some of the rewards to offer for them, but ambassadors, it's feedback and impact.
Yeah.
Okay. How can you see which promotional channels are being the most effective? How can you measure that?
Okay. So there are two fundamental mechanisms for doing this that you should have access to. So obviously, if you haven't got Google Analytics or the equivalent set up on whatever platform you're using, I'd strongly advise getting it set up. It will tell you where traffic is coming from. One of the challenges, though, is it won't necessarily tell you what that traffic is doing on the site or where it's converting to. That depends on having a number of additional things set up to track the conversion rates all the way through the platform. Obviously, Hubbub's been working in this space for a long time. We know it's super important to get people to know the impact of the particular channels and the people sharing content. And so we've put a lot of effort into building the tools that will allow people to track that end to end. So if I, as an ambassador, sign up for a campaign, I can not only see who I've referred, I can also see how much they've gone on to give. I can see what channels I've referred them from, and so can the person running the campaign itself, and so can the people who are administering that entire platform. So yeah, this is a really, I mean, it's all about getting the right balance of tools and functionality in there. The one thing I would say, though, is that there is also there's a danger of getting too lost in the data. If we come back above this and say these are useful tools, but what they tend to be most useful for is figuring out how you run the next one. Being able to, in real time, respond to a particular, an appearance of additional engagement on some network, and actually change your strategy because of that. That's extremely complicated, because you have to remember, you've done all your campaign planning, you've done all your messaging planning, you've done all the images that you intend to share by this point. So what my feeling is that the focus of somebody in the middle of a campaign should be on making sure that they are continually putting out the best messaging to the right people. And then you look at the really detailed data around how did engagement happen on that campaign, more as a retrospective analysis for working out how to run the next one. Otherwise, in the middle of a campaign, you can get lost in data. And we certainly have seen a couple of people do that. So they've driven masses of traffic to a campaign, but they drove all the wrong kind of traffic. When they tried to adjust this on, effectively on the day, mid-campaign, it left everybody confused, because the messaging of the campaign suddenly changed to something else. Yeah.
And that gets noticed.
It really does, yeah.
You mentioned using data and planning to use it again. And I know that's one of your chief concerns about what you've learned from crowdfunding so far, that a crowdfunding campaign should never really be a single campaign. Tell us more about how you see it, what you see a sensible approach to crowdfunding. Yeah,
so whilst I completely understand the desire to pilot something new and do a self-contained project and a pilot in this area, really crowdfunding is part of a bigger digital fundraising mix that is becoming a more important component of everybody's program. And the challenge of looking at crowdfunding the other way around, rather than thinking how do I run one major campaign, I think about how would I resource a program of 20 campaigns a year, leads you into many more constructive conversations about the long-term donor relationship, the data that we need to acquire at the point where someone's giving the first time, the segments of people and how we treat them both before, during, and after the campaign, how we can upgrade people, what the overall thematic area is of our digital fundraising channels. So, it basically, what we really need to be doing is building the bigger digital picture of our campaign strategy when we look at crowdfunding, because crowdfunding's got these two key elements. It's got how we find the best campaigns and how we disseminate. It puts the digital fundraising office in a place where effectively the fundraising team becomes a curator of the very best content and ideas that are out there based around the organization's mission, rather than necessarily being the originator of all content and all campaigns. So I guess the challenge I would say is, rather than asking the question, which this webinar is entitled, this is how to run a major crowdfunding campaign, but rather than asking this question, we instead should be asking the question, how can I use crowdfunding to drive, drive £1 million worth of donations over the next 3 years? And if we look at it that way around, it raises all sorts of different questions that are much more strategic than just raising the money for one project. And it also builds much more long-term relationships with donors, supporters, trustees, advocates, ambassadors, all the audiences we need for the growth of digital.
So crowdfunding is not a standalone fundraising discipline, a one-off. It should be seen as part of ongoing investment.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you look at some of the ways it's being used most effective, a lot of work that's been gone on fundraising and crowdfunding side by side. And that's the program that we would encourage people to do. Digital gives you a chance to expand the reach of your telephone campaign, to grow the reach of a direct mail campaign. These are not isolated and competitive activities. They're all part of an individual giving strategy. So yeah, use them together.
Yeah. So part of a multi. Start with Jonathan May, and my name is Howard Lake. If you joined us after the beginning, we've discussed or heard from Jonathan about how to plan your campaign, your major crowdfunding campaign, and we've also heard about how to utilize networks. So do please ask any questions you want via the chat, and we will try and answer them towards the end. And we've got 2 more sessions left. We've got donor data, and we've got tools and communities. So we'll move on to donor data and ask Jonathan, can you go through any particular data protection issues that crowdfunding organisers should consider and plan for?
Okay. So there's a couple of different elements here. So there's data protection, and then there's data gathering in the first place. So the first thing to point out is that there's really two kind of key engagement points with a relationship to the data that is going through crowdfunding platforms. So the first of them is data about the people that are actively engaging with the campaign. So they're either sharing messages, they're giving to the campaign, they're becoming advocates, ambassadors. So effectively they're signing up on a platform, whether that's an in-house one or a third-party one, however that works. And the critical thing, certainly from my point of view, and what I always say to fundraisers in the space is, those are your data. They belong to that third-party platform. They belong to you, and it's going to be on you to figure out how you steward those people, how you reach out to them, what experience of that, what experience you want them to have after that initial piece of so the first thing that's super important is working out what do we actually want to know about those people. I mean, do we want to know how they gave the campaign? Do we want to know enough from them to be able to gift aid donation? Do we need to know what they live? We probably do if we're intending to give them a reward. Otherwise perhaps not. Do we want their email, phone number? Effectively, going away and thinking about this as part of your overall plan and your overall strategy, define the data that you really want to be collecting. This is one of the challenges the sector has, however, which is that most of the platforms won't allow you to customize what data you collect. In fact, in many cases, they won't even hand you the data unless that's listed contact by you. So it's super important that you do that planning around, what do you want to put back into your CRM? What is the long-term stewardship journey? And then how do I get the platform to give me? If they won't, how do I reach out to that audience in a different way as part of the campaign communication to try and incentivize those people to get directly in touch with the organization? So are there other forms that I can use? Can I get people to give me that information elsewhere? The second point of contact with the data is whether or not there's data you load yourself into a crowdfunding platform or some kind of ambassador management tool to try and get people to actively support the cause. And we could run off into a rabbit hole of GDPR and consent, but it is highly relevant to work out whether for each of those different channels you're intending to rely on a legitimate interest argument, whether you actually have consent to do this kind of activity. And that's these are the same questions you would have to answer if you went about running almost anything actually in this space on digital, on email. You really need to work out whether or not you have a real legitimate interest to contact these people and use their data for this purpose, or whether or not you have consent to let them into it. The one thing I would say though, crowdfunding is giving you an incredible way of engaging with audiences that you may not currently know whether you have consent to contact, or you may need to upgrade that consent in some way. And an email shot to ask people to give consent might be effective, but some kind of incentivized form of email shot where that we're running this amazing campaign, we'd love you to take a look at it. We think it might be of interest to you because we know you're interested in X, Y, Z. If you'd consider taking a look at it, making a small donation, at which point we can ask to upgrade the consent. So you can think of this as part of a strategy to re-engage people on digital. We obviously have a fairly tight deadline to do this, and I would say crowdfunding should be part of that mix in terms of re-engaging people. And then I would just one tiny point on that. If we're running a program, so rather than looking at one-off campaigns, if we're running a 25 project a year program, we're in another kind of paradigm, if you will, of marketing activity. Because what will be happening then is that people will be actively fundraising for projects within the overall theme on behalf of the organization. And people reaching out to personal contacts, people reaching out to professional contacts on behalf of their organization using social media and email is an entirely unplanned for paradigm when it comes to the legislation around GDPR. And so it's just another area to look at. My suspicion is, although I'm not a lawyer, that this is one of those where, given you are relying on personal, professional relationships and existing engagements on social media, you're in a much better place than you would be as an organization directly marketing to the same audiences using digital direct mail, telephone, or social media in the first place. So it's a way of distributing the ask, which puts it on a much better footing.
And we should add that given that we have an international audience joining us today, that these are specifically for UK considerations, the general data protection regulation and so on.
Yes.
Okay. Once you've gathered the data appropriately, legitimately, and accurately, can you say how and why one would segment the data?
Okay, well, let's say you've gathered information on who's given, how much they've given, which country they're based in, and why they gave to that campaign. I probably don't need to go much further. Once you have that information, it's clear that anybody who's contributed a few hundred to £1,000 plus on the campaign is somebody that should be stewarded in an entirely different way than you might steward the same £5 donor to that campaign. In fact, crowdfunding is regularly used to acquire unexpected major donor relationships. Most of the 100K plus campaigns that we've seen have acquired 10K plus donors through crowdfunding.
Is that intentional, or is that just a fortunate byproduct? Or can you almost, is that very likely now if you start running a large campaign?
Well, I'm going to say yes if you do it right.
Okay.
There will always be people in your second or third degree network who are connected to some of your first degree network, who therefore as a result understand and relate to your cause, your message, and can be reached very directly and very personally by those first order contacts. So it's sort of inevitable that if the campaign messaging is right and is done right, and the ambassador communications are done right, that you will acquire some of those really valuable second or third degree connections to the campaign. And obviously then taking it one step further, and when we talked about the motivations for people giving, we have a number of people using Hubbub platforms to ask people whether they would consider making a regular monthly gift. And the engagement rate on that checkbox, it's entirely opt-in checkbox, is between about 5 and 20%, depending on the campaign and the strength of the messaging around. that's exactly the kind of question which then requires a detailed stewardship plan. And so I guess this is the obvious reasons why you segment. And it's obvious you have to do this work in advance. So it's where do we want to send people, and what journeys we're going to take them on, so we can make sure we've got the data at the point they give to be able to do that segmentation work.
And how easy is it to incorporate this data that you've generated, the results, into your existing CRM? I know there are many different types, but do organizations working at this level find that straightforward, or are there challenges?
So there are challenges. Getting data back into a CRM, which came out of a digital platform, it should be easy. The reality is, though, that people who've given to you online using a crowdfunding campaign might have used the same name or address or email address as someone who's already in your database, probably have. That causes problems when you import, because obviously you don't want to create duplicate records. You need to be able to have a process of matching those. And this is something that I know some solutions exist. Razor's Edge has some import tools that will make some of this a little easier. But basically, the two things to be confident about when you're going about trying to decide what technology to use are, one, that I can get the data out of the platform, the right data is being recorded and it can be downloaded. The second is that I have a plan in advance for how I'm going to do rapid gift processing. Because one of the things that you really don't want to have is a long delay between the data coming out of the platform and the first subsequent interaction with those donors. You know, they gave very quickly on a digital platform. The last thing they're expecting is a 3 to 6 month lag time before the data gets incorporated. So, yeah. And if anybody's interested in talking about the complexities of doing this in more detail, I'm quite happy to take that kind of conversation offline. So.
I'm going to move to the final session, which will be on tools and communities. And if you do have any questions, then do please chip in using the chat box to the right-hand side. If for any reason we can't deal with all of the questions, or you remember one later, I'm sure Jonathan will answer subsequent to the webinar. I think before we move on to the final session on tools and communities, there was a key model that you wanted to look at, a particular graph.
There was, so.
Underpins understanding of successful major crowdfunding. Yeah,
if you turn to pages 17 and 18 in particular, the one with the lovely little picture there of a graph, this is a model that we borrowed from another discipline. This is a discipline of new product launches, typically in the technology space, called Crossing the Chasm. And applied to the digital space, digital fundraising space, this explains in a lot of detail how to go about engaging the right kind of audiences at different stages of the crowdfunding campaign. So in the early days, the focus should be on direct relationships with people who can become really interesting advocates, influencers, and initial contributors to a campaign. Now, many of those relationships, as an organization, when we approach a crowdfunding campaign, we will already have. There'll be people that are on our major donor list, trustees, board members, and sometimes also even people that we have on the direct mail fundraising list. So the point is, we have relationships with them. They are engaged with us, and we need to get those people involved in the early days. Later on in the campaign, when we're looking at the much bigger audiences that are out there, these are typically people we don't have a strong relationship with. And the way of reaching those audiences and giving them confidence that this is something for them to engage in is by already having the innovators, the early adopters, effectively those people that would contribute in the early days. Effectively, if you look at the model, what the early majority and the late majority are looking for is increasing degrees of social proof for why they should get engaged and involved in this campaign. And that can only come through the peer networks. It can't come from your organization itself. So this model is critical to understanding the engagement strategy and the plan for how to run a campaign, and it's why we put so much emphasis in this guide on your influencer and early adopter communications and planning, because that's what ultimately drives the ability to really reach the public audiences at scale.
So that's a key element of success.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Final section is tools and communities. If you do have any questions to ask Jonathan, then by all means use the chat function, and we will endeavour to answer them in a few minutes' time. So, tools for communities. What tools are available to help someone manage and organise a major crowdfunding campaign?
Okay, so there's a few different things here. Obviously, we talked very briefly about platforms. Eventually, you're going to need a platform, and eventually, you're probably going to need some way of managing your ambassador network or advocates network. Naturally, I've said, and I genuinely believe in this, platforms do not introduce you to donors. Yeah. So what matters is to go about figuring out what bits of data I need, what actually are my requirements for that platform. Are there bits of functionality or features that are important to me? How do I want to handle the stewardship journey, the communications, the branding, all of that? They're the questions you need to ask. Because at a very simple basis, managing an advocate or an ambassador list can be as simple as just having a spreadsheet in Google Sheets or in Excel. However, if you want to be able to track the impact of that sharing, you need a more sophisticated tool to do that. So obviously the first thing to say here is that Hubbub has put a lot of work, obviously, into building the tools for the charity sector specifically to be able to get the data they want, control over the relationships, and track all of the impact of that. The other thing I've got in this guide is a couple of examples of running distributed teams and making sure that you have effectively to-do list management works, but not necessarily all sat in the same office. And the reason for this is that because crowdfunding tends to second in people from slightly different teams for slightly different purposes, you need a different, you often need anyway, a different way of building that team and managing its interactions than in your day-to-day job. You might be sat next to everybody you're working with. So in here, we've made some recommendations of tools such as Slack, which is a discussion tool. Trello for simple project management, which allows you to bring multiple people in, web-based to-do list management. Obviously, using something like Dropbox, right, to share content, so you're not working with Word documents the whole time that are difficult to share. And then, obviously, you're going to get an audience off the back of this, so it is important to think about where that audience goes. It's not some kind of skill or some kind of system for managing relationships. Otherwise, you key values of crowdfunding, which is all those new relationships. So it's recommended tools here, and I just encourage you to take a look at them. None of these are expensive. These are all things which cost next to nothing on those.
So, and as you can see, the download to the report that Jonathan is talking about is available in the handout section on your screen. So by all means use that if you've not had have a read of it already. Finally, what crowdfunding communities are there out there? Where's all this experience and expertise being shared with questions and answers? Can you recommend any venues, online or offline?
Yeah, so there are some existing places where these conversations are happening. I think in the US, there's a very nice higher education mailing list called Fundlist. Higher education, lots of conversations about digital giving, crowdfunding. I would say the non-profit space, it's a little quieter. In the UK, the e-campaigning forum list has a fair bit on this, so look up the Fair Say list, that's a really good place. Hubbub set up a while ago a list specifically for non-profits looking at crowdfunding as a medium. It's called Crowdfund List, so you can go on there, crowdfundlist.org, and sign up if you'd like to ask questions. And that's an open list. It's got 300 or 400 people on from across higher education, non-profit, some in the US, some in the UK, some in Europe. I think there's even a couple from Australia. So it's a good list of where all these best practices are. There is, of course, a challenge here, which is that crowdfunding is still a relatively new area. There are resources being created and communities sort of popping up and going. So what my recommendation is, build two types of groups. One with the people who, so one with the lists I've recommended, so be on and around those. The Fundraising Chat Facebook group is another great one. If you're not on the Fundraising Chat Facebook group in the UK, there are lots of conversations about digital fundraising and crowdfunding on there. So connect with those lists. Also try and connect with some key sector professionals that know this space. So if you've got one or two relationships with companies, organizations, or individuals who know this space well, it means that when that community moves to one or the other different places, or when the conversations you'll still match where those are.
And any other tools or resources on Hubbub's site to draw people's attention to?
Sure, we have a couple. Firstly, it's well worth looking at the ambassador management that we created fairly recently. It's a tool for allowing you to onboard and manage the relationships with social, so the very people that drive the traffic to your campaign. There are also a number of tools that we've built to help you look at the audience, so based on your existing databases or based on your social media accounts, finding who might be the best audience, influencers and advocates for you based on those audiences. So basically cutting down from potentially 5, 10,000, 100,000 to 50 people that you should be reaching out to. We call that tool Sherlock, and it's well worth having a look. For obvious reasons, we call it Sherlock. It helps you find those.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's been asking questions. I know Christina Prachalis, who's with us, has answered quite a few of those, certainly on the tech issues that have cropped up, and apologies for those, particularly with audio questions. So we've still got some time to answer some of these, and I'm going to look for Craig's message at the top. Yes, I found it. Right. How can digital practically integrate with support or support major individual
And corporate giving.
Yes, I want to answer that.
How can digital practically integrate with or support major individual giving and corporate giving? So, I mean, essentially there are two key elements in this, the way I see it. The first is digital is a way of acquiring relationships with people that you might have previously struggled to get engaged in the first place. So as we talked about this earlier, you know, potential major donors and organizations will sometimes find those campaigns as second or third degree contact. In fact, they often do. And those relationships, essentially digital can be used to acquire some new prospects as major donors. And the other way of looking at it, and it's the one that I'm most keen on, is that particularly in the lower level major donor programs that organizations already run, so the £1,000 a year up to about £25,000 a year donors, who typically cost quite a lot of money to onboard and also maintain as part of that stewardship journey, relative to their gift size. Those are fairly expensive people to look after. And what crowdfunding gives you a way to do is engage them in what I would call high impact donor acquisition activity. So if we can get those people to contribute, rather than giving their £5,000 centrally to the organisation once a year, we get them to put their £5,000 in as match funding or challenge funding on an active project that's being crowdfunded. Those people get an amazing stewardship journey. So every single time somebody gives that, they can feel like they've unlocked more money, and they've built real future capacity. But B, you've also given them something which really costs almost nothing. So getting those people engaged and involved, typically would mean inviting them to an event, physically meeting them, or giving them some kind of really quite expensive. But just adding them on as a major donor to a crowdfunding campaign gives them masses of personal benefit and impact, and the ability to feel like they've made a difference at really quite minimal cost to the organisation. So those experiences tend to lead to upgrade. So we have a upgrade of major donors. So we have a number of clients that have used this to take donors from the £5,000 level up to the £25,000, £50,000 level, just by delivering such brilliant stewardship journeys for them.
My apologies for the quality of the audio. We've received a lot of messages on that. We've been trying to fix it, but clearly haven't quite achieved that, so apologies for that. There is a recording being made of this, so we will see if we can address those issues in the recording. If you have any questions that don't get answered in 5 minutes or so, then please email them to hello@hubbub.net. and we will endeavour to answer those after the event. But let's press on and try and get a few more in. Evelyn wants to know, how realistic is this type of technique for organisations that don't have established networks or donor databases at scale?
Okay, so what I would say is that what matters from the point of view of resourcing major crowdfunding campaigns or even digital giving programs is not what your existing network is. What matters is how much time, energy, and effort you yourselves as an organization can dedicate to it. With the right messaging and the right time investment, you can stimulate engagement with quite wide communities on the web very quickly. One of the things we know about digital and social in particular is that messages can spread like wildfire through communities where they hit the of the space effectively. So it's not about do I have massive social media presence? Do I have a huge donor base? It's about what's the audience going to care about, and how much effort can I put into engaging them in the first place? I would say that the same is true of almost any fundraising activity. So before jumping in and deciding to do anything, you're going to look at how much time I'm going to put in, what it's going to cost me to do that, and what I think the long-term return on investment is going to be of doing that. In many ways, this kind of activity is much more feasible for smaller organizations than doing their very first telephone campaign or their first direct mail campaign. The upfront costs associated with them, both in terms of internal time and external consultancy and support, tend to far outweigh what the cost would be to start doing activity on digital. So I think what I would say is think about it as how much internal time and capacity do we have, not what network do we have today. It's certainly feasible to build networks in retrospect, is what I'm saying, with the right techniques.
That's very encouraging. Kira wants to know, how long do the campaigns you're talking about generally run? If it's months and it's all or nothing funding, how do organizations generally deal with gift processing and thanking donors? Okay,
so almost irrespective of the size of the campaign, I would strongly advise never running something over about 8 weeks. For a sub 100K campaign, 4 to 6 weeks is pretty much optimal based on the data around this. This is because the longer you run a campaign for, the longer the period in the middle is between the first week and the last week. And most crowdfunding campaigns follow a pattern, which is that partly, and I'll come on back to that sort of model of engagement, but there are lots of people who engage in the first week because it's the first time you ask them, and they're quite happy to get involved when you first ask them because they're excited about it. There are then a lot of people that engage at the end because there's an urgency, a deadline, and also, frankly, because you probably got nervous towards the end of the campaign and started hammering them with messages. So keep the campaign as tight as possible. That period in the middle tends to be a real dead zone. The only real reason for having a long campaign, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, is if you haven't properly done the planning around your major donor, your corporate relations, your match funding, your challenge funding. So if you've done that work well in advance, you don't then have to do it in the middle of a campaign. The public campaign element can just be the end of a much longer piece of fundraising work. So do the 3 months of getting the match funders, the major donors, the ambassadors, advocates all lined up in advance, then run a really short digital campaign, 4 to 6 weeks tops. The question's still relevant though. So how do we do real-time thanking, right, when we run even a 4 to 6 week campaign? And so the most important thing is that whether this is done through the platform or by a person, is that when a gift comes in, essentially within a day, ideally within an hour, there is at least some form of communication to acknowledge that gift. And that can be automated initially from the campaign or from the platform. Certainly something we've done a fair bit of in Hubbub is customizing those thank you emails so that they really look like they've come from an individual and the personal outreach, which is what they should be. When it comes to worrying about then how do we actually start that person's stewardship journey in the long run, that's a really complicated one, because in the middle of a campaign, if somebody's given to that campaign or contributed to it, and you start distracting or deflecting them off other activities before that campaign is concluded and been successful, you've not yet given them that buzz of having made something happen. And this is one of the reasons to keep campaigns short, but it's critical that they almost graduate from their first-time gift into becoming a longer-term supporter by going through the successful close of that campaign. If they haven't made that leap, they're not yet completely feeling like they're part of your cause or your organization. And then I think the final thing is you asked about all or nothing funding specifically. If you use an all or nothing funding model, So, and this model is traditionally used for two purposes. It's to protect the person trying to raise the money from having to do a campaign with not enough resource. And it's to protect the donor from having given to something that can't be delivered if it doesn't reach a certain target. Okay? If the reality is that you're going to do a bunch of this work anyway, and there is really a really quite a small minimum amount that you're going to go and raise, then be honest, set the minimum at the target that you really need as the viability point. Don't set it at 100k or 150k, confident about getting to that target. All or nothing essentially is not the model to use when you're intending to keep most of the donations anyway, or where they would make a massive difference to your ability to do the program. It's what you would do if you really can't run that program if you don't get the money. So this is one of the things we didn't cover in platform selection, but based on that project goal setting, that's what should determine whether or not you use an all or nothing model or a keep it all model. And the platform you use needs to be able to support that model. It's a bit of a tragedy when you see campaigns on 50, 60k out of 100k and then they don't succeed, when actually the organization intends to run the project anyway and could have taken that money in. So.
Thank you. One of you asked, can we share the lists, because the quality of the audio meant you didn't get to hear them. So yes, we'll make sure that anything that isn't in the download, isn't in the report that we covered today, we'll make sure there's a list that we can send to you afterwards. And you will very shortly get a feedback form. Please do tell us how we can improve it in addition to the audio quality, and we will act on that as well. So thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I wanted to try and keep the time, so apologies for not dealing with the question from Laura about the large multi-million-pound research project, which doesn't have examples, case study examples of success. I'll ask Jonathan to respond to that afterwards. Thank you very much indeed to everyone, for in particular to Jonathan May of Hubbub for producing the report and for sharing that and answering some of the many questions you've. So thank you very much indeed. Do join us for a future Hubbub event. If there's any more questions, do email them directly to hello@hubbub.net. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That's all right. I'm glad it wasn't lost on you because something I'm looking at.